I'll introduce you in Greek. Don't mind. Λοιπόν, καλησπέρα. Καλώς ήρθατε. Απόψε έχουμε τη χαρά να φιλοξενούμε τον κύριο Uğur Zekeriya Peçe, ο οποίος διδάσκει στο Πανεπιστήμιο Lehigh στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες. Έκανε τη διατριβή του στο Στάνφορντ με θέμα την ύστερη Οθωμανική Κρήτη και πρόσφατα το καλοκαίρι που πέρασε εκδόθηκε το βιβλίο του με θέμα, όπως βλέπετε, Island and Empire, How Civil War in Crete Mobilized the Ottoman World. Και θα μας μιλήσει σήμερα με θέμα την έρευνα που έκανε και το βιβλίο του. Αυτή τη στιγμή έχει μία υποτροφία από το ARIT, το American Research Institute in Turkey, και ασχολείται με τα ηχοτοπία της Επανάστασης των Νεότουρκων του 1908. So, thank you for being with us tonight, and we're looking forward.
Okay. Thank you so much, Adoni, for this introduction. Είμαι πολύ ευτυχισμένος που είμαι εδώ για να μιλήσω για το βιβλίο μου, γιατί αυτό το βιβλίο γεννήθηκε στη Κρήτη πριν πολλά χρόνια. Και για αυτό το λόγο είμαι πολύ χαρούμενος που είμαι εδώ. Thank you again for inviting me to speak at the Institute. So this is my first time talking about this book, which came out in the summer on this island. So in Turkey, as you know, there are hundreds of thousands of people whose ancestors had to immigrate from Crete during the late 19th and early 20th century. Disclosure, I'm not one of them, so I don't have any Cretan roots. Although I grew up in Istanbul, my roots are in the Eastern Black Sea region, Pondos, and only over the years did I realize that my native land, Black Sea, and my research land, or my research island, Crete, have some striking commonalities. The dizzying dances, high-tempo music, lira. But to me, the most important is that both in Crete and in my village in the Black Sea, by the way, people in that village speak Turkish, but there are many words from Greek in daily language. So both in Crete and in my village in the Black Sea, the word for snails is choklios. So you might be wondering why I'm talking about snails. I'm not talking about snails because on a map, Crete looks a little bit like a snail without the shell. Today I arrived in Iraklio, and what I saw in the airport was this McDonald's in Crete. I was not interested because of the McDonald's, but I was interested because of this visual. These balloons almost make this snail complete, adding the shell. But I think what's important about snails is Muslims of Crete in the past and their descendants in Turkey today, most of them, enjoyed eating snails like Christians in Crete. This is one reason why after their forced migration to the Ottoman Empire, in some Anatolian Muslim communities, some Cretan Muslims were called Musulman Gavurides, Muslim infidels. Although eating snails is not haram in Islam, in Turkey, it is mostly a cultural taboo. We even have a saying in Turkish, Müslüman mahallesinde salyangoz satmak. In English, it would be selling snails in a Muslim neighborhood. This is used to refer to something that is offensive to one's culture or religion or tradition. I know some stories from my friends who had families immigrating from Crete in the early 20s, 1930s, during the Republican era in Turkey. They would get together, Cretan Turks. They would still speak Kritika, and they would cook Cretan food, including snails, hidden from the gaze of their Anatolian Muslim neighbors because of this fraught expression about eating snails or selling snails in a Muslim neighborhood. I am telling this to suggest that Muslim Cretans who had to leave the island and then were resettled in Asia Minor, Libya, and Syria were a unique community. They came with their island culture, which distinguished them from already established Muslim communities in Anatolia. Their island characteristics made them a cohesive group in the eyes of others, not only with their snails, they also came with their language. They were native speakers of Greek, or maybe I should say Kritika. When I say Greek, sometimes, my Cretan friends correct me, say, it's not Greek, it's Kritika. So they spoke Cretan Greek. In academic history books, even in recent years, you can come across a very general but mistaken claim, which is Ottoman Muslims did not have last names. This is mostly true. Most of the Ottoman Muslims did not have last names. Last names were given to Muslims in the 1920s, late 1920s, under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. But there is an exception to that. Cretan Muslims, they came also with their last names. So this is a petition sent to the municipality of Iraklio during the autonomous period in Crete, early 1900s. So you have some Christian names. You also have some Turkish Muslim names. I didn't highlight all of them, but some of these highlighted names, Muslim names, last names are, as you can see, Zolanakis, Rubakis, Kaimakis, Teftadarakis, Fafulakis, Bilalakis. And there are many instances like that. All these people, after they had to leave Crete in the 1920s, 30s, they had to change their last names to totally, most of the time, irrelevant names. They had to be Turkified, these names. So I believe this semi-biographical introduction provides some kind of a clue into my motivations as a historian. In my talk today, I will focus on the period after 1908. In October 1908, the government in Crete announced its decision to unite with Greece, Enosis. This union did not materialize until 1913, but it triggered hundreds of protest rallies in the Ottoman Empire. Turkish Cretans took the leading part in these demonstrations. Before getting into this, I would like to start by reading the first paragraph of my book to take you to 1896. And I believe in my documents, it's not very certain where this incident takes place, but I believe it is outside of one of the gates in Iraklio, Kenuria Porta, because this is the gate looking to south, and we have a scene in which thousands of refugees, Muslim refugees from southern villages are trying to enter the city, but they cannot because the Ottoman governor doesn't let them. Under a scorching August sun in 1896, more than 5,000 displaced Muslim peasants congregated outside the city of Iraklio, beside two corpses of their co-religionists. The bodies had been brought there from Larani, a village about 20 miles south. Reports conflicted as to how they had been killed. The Muslim sources claimed that the killings had occurred as the victims attempted to collect their belongings from the village, now under Christian control. Rival accounts maintained that they were ambushed and shot dead by a grieving father, avenging his teenage son, who had been murdered in trying to prevent the two from pillaging their farm. Before the city gates lay the two lifeless bodies to be presented to the European diplomats stationed in Iraklio as evidence that death was roaming the land. It was in this heated moment that Hasan Pasha, the governor of Iraklio, the most populous district in Ottoman Crete, encountered the refugee villagers, a frustrated multitude denouncing the authorities and crying for passage through the gates. Anxious to keep the tense atmosphere in the city under control, the governor denied them permission to enter and parade the dead bodies through the streets leading to the European consulates. If you want to continue subjecting us to the slaughter, a voice rose from the crowd as fingers pointed to the corpses. Look. The insults from the angry group soon turned physical, with some protesters pulling Hasan Pasha from his horse and attacking him with sticks. Thanks to several helping hands extended to the fallen Pasha, he managed to move away and throw himself into a shop, finding there a side door exit into a garden. Hasan Pasha then headed through a back street to the government konak. In this turmoil, Hasan Pasha lost his fez. Lost too was the prestige that a high-ranking Ottoman administrator needed most at this time of upheaval in Crete. With the gate now under the control of the refugee demonstrators, the displaced, long made to wait in anxiety outside the city walls, poured into Iraklio. So on this violent day and hundreds of others prior, most of Crete was in a state of turmoil. Anchored off strategic locations along its shores were the battleships of Britain, France, Italy, Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary. On the island's mountains, far from the coast, were Christian insurgents in an armed struggle against the Ottoman administration as they attempted to help in the annexation of Crete to Greece. And across the island's fertile valleys, isolated villages, coastal towns were scenes befitting a civil war. Smoke rising from villages ablaze, churches and mosques demolished, Muslim and Christian cemeteries defiled, olive trees burned, vineyards destroyed, tens of thousands of civilians internally displaced, and an unknown number of islanders murdered. So the episode at the gates of Iraklio in August 1896 paints a picture of how displacement and death catalyzed collective action on an island. This relationship motivates the central question that my book explores in a much broader context from the late 19th century through World War I. So the main question is, how are displacement, death, European intervention, and protest connected in the Ottoman world? So the confrontation between the refugee villagers and Hasan Pasha sets the stage for a narrative of displacement and collective action in the Ottoman Empire. So based on research in multiple local and national archives, my book starts with the examination of the large-scale violence between Christians and Muslims in the 1890s in Crete. And I talk about this as a case of civil war. So this is what I talk about in chapter 1. In chapter 2, I talk about the European military intervention in Crete, and I focus on how European intervention changed the ethnic religious picture in Crete and resulted eventually in the displacement of Muslims from the island. And the European intervention, those who led the European intervention in these countries that I talked about earlier, they saw displacement as a solution rather than the problem. So for most of the European diplomats and the soldiers, when you look at their accounts, written accounts, the idea is that if Muslims leave the island, this will eventually bring peace to Crete. If Muslims and Christians who fought each other in the civil war stay on the island after all the destruction, there will never be peace coming to this island. And it will be very costly for us, for the Europeans, to bring peace to this island. So the easiest solution is for these Muslims to leave. I'm not going to talk about this today because of time, but this is just the gist of the chapter. In chapter 3, I talk about Kritiki Politia, the autonomous period in Crete in the early 1900s. And basically, I try to understand what it meant to be a Muslim minority, Turkish minority in Crete. There were still about 40,000 Turkish or Muslim Cretans living in Crete during the autonomy, and about 70,000, 80,000 people had already left the island for the Ottoman provinces. And my focus in this chapter is the case of Spinalonga, which was an exclusively Muslim settlement, and how Muslims from that small island off the coast of Crete were driven away, and that small island eventually was turned into a leper colony, and which remained active until the 1950s, I believe. Chapter 4 and 5, I leave the island, but the shadow of the island remains, and I focus on cities and towns in the Ottoman Empire where protests against Greece took place. And in these protests, some of these protests are rallies, public rallies, manifestations. Some of these protests are economic boycott of Greece and also Greeks in the Ottoman Empire. In these protests, the main thing is that Cretan refugees who were settled in different parts of the Ottoman Empire took the active role, the leading role. So they were the main drivers of this protest movement in the Ottoman Empire in the period between 1908 and 1912. So one of my main arguments in this book is that the civil war in Crete during the 1890s did not really end with the displacement of Turkish Cretans and the establishment of an autonomous government in Crete in 1898. The unhealed scars of the civil war explain why Turkish Cretans became the leading force of popular protest against Greece in the Ottoman Empire after 1908. I flesh this out in more detail in the conclusion of my book, which is constructed around the story of Hüseyin Nesimi. So, if people in Turkey today know anything about Hüseyin Nesimi, it is that he was killed while trying to save Ottoman Armenians during the genocide in 1915. He was the district administrator of the town of Lice in the province of Diyarbakir in southeastern Anatolia. He was killed for opposing the killing orders of the government. We remember him for his righteousness towards Armenians, but know little about his strong anti-Greek opinions. In the book, I try to solve this following puzzle. How did his stance toward Armenians, which in the end claimed his own life, coexist with his intense anti-Greek views? So Nesimi himself witnessed the civil war in the 1890s in Crete. He was from Hania and wrote a 3-volume book about the atrocities against the island's Muslims called Girit Ailesi. In English, it would be translated Cretan Tragedy. So this book has about like 700 pages. So I try to answer this puzzle by inviting the reader to take seriously possible impacts of a formative experience of violence on Nesimi in the 1890s in Crete. Just checking the time. Because civil war has such a central place in my book, it's even in the title, I would like to spend a little time on why I prefer this terminology before I focus on the post-1908 period. I prefer this terminology instead of revolt, rebellion, or revolution. While most Turkish historiography saw the events in Crete during the 1890s as an uprising or revolt against the Ottoman state at the instigation of foreign agents, Greek historiography has traditionally studied the same events as a revolution against an oppressive empire. Kritik Epanastasi, right? And this was the latest, the final Kritik Epanastasi, which ended for those who believed in that account successfully, right? So this was, in a way, the successful culmination as the belated fruition of the Greek Revolution of the 1820s. Because throughout the 19th century, according to this narrative, Cretan Christians took up arms against the Ottoman Empire several times in the 1820s, 1830s, 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, 1889, and finally in the mid-1890s, right? I mean, some even see Theriso uprising in 1905 as the continuation of some kind of a Cretan revolution, this time against, let's say, quote-unquote, deep Greek state, against the Prince George. So a binary of revolution or revolt, I believe, flattens a complex conflict into a neatly defined clash between insurgents and soldiers. A strife that claimed thousands of lives, demolished countless homes, generated tens of thousands of refugees, and destroyed more than 1 million olive trees, needs a different descriptor to highlight ruin across the physical and human landscape of Crete. The idea of revolution and revolt has proven pervasive in making sense of this conflict, not because it captures well the experiences of historical actors. Its prevalence, I argue, typifies histories of ethnic violence in which the state often serves as the primary agent rather than common people. Another reason why I am insistent on civil war is because it is an occasion that shows the human beings at their worst and at their best simultaneously. Civil wars are not only about neighbors killing neighbors, but also about individuals rescuing at the risk of their own lives, those who happen to be on the wrong side. My story in chapter 1 is inevitably a violent story, but it's also a hopeful story with examples of interreligious rescue. Christians rescuing Muslims, Muslims rescuing Christians. And this is very natural, but this is not something that is very much emphasized most of the time when you read histories of ethno-religious conflict. So in the book, I made an effort to emphasize such hopeful instances of rescue not only because they offer a more honest and more complete history. There's another reason, and as historian, I see this as a way to express my debt and gratitude to so many Cretans, friends, acquaintances, and strangers who showed me much hospitality and generosity every time I stayed in this island from 2010 until today. So therefore, I dedicate this book, I quote, to the generous people of Crete yesterday and today. So defining civil war as a strife between communities that are familiar with one another, communities that share a common culture, I underscore the element of intimacy between the island's Christians and Muslims. In so doing, I call into question sectarian and nationalistic interpretations of conflict. The terminology of civil war also aligns with the experiences of historical actors and how they understood the conflict. For instance, in June 1896, in his letter from the Preveli Monastery to the Ottoman administration, Bishop Evmenios, Bishop Evmenios complained about attacks against Christian civilians, noting that the island was on the brink of a civil war, and the word he used was emphilion. In a letter written to Muslim notables, the Bishop of Rethymno, Dionysios, pictured there, underlined the affinity between Christians and Muslims. And I quote, "We both live in the same land, we breathe the same air, we have the same origin, the same customs, we are speaking the same language, we have the same natural vices and virtues," end quote. Around the same time, when Dionysios wrote this letter, Meşveret, the leading Young Turk newspaper in exile in Paris, expressed dismay at, I quote, "the shedding of blood among the brothers of the country living together for centuries." So the word that Meşveret used, phrase that the newspaper used was "Vatan kardeşleri," brothers of the country. There are many more examples like that, which suggest that people living at that time, people who experienced the conflict, they saw it as a civil war rather than a revolution against empire or uprising against empire. Okay, there was no such value judgment in most of the contemporary accounts. As Stathis Kalivas argues in his book on civil war in Greece in the 40s, violence in civil war is frequently exercised among people who share membership in a legally recognized or imagined community. The size and topographic variety of Crete made up an island in which peasants living in Kissamos, for instance, maintained little contact with people living in Stia. Similarly, the physical and sociocultural landscape of highlanders in southwestern Crete, in Sfakia, in Selinos, was incomparable to that of the lowlanders to the north, people living in the cities or near the cities. Nevertheless, I believe inhabiting an island with outer boundaries clearly defined and fixed by the sea made an imagined community easier to imagine. Turkish Cretans, so now I am fast forwarding to 1908, 10 more years. Turkish Cretans displaced by the civil war were resettled in Asia Minor, Syria, and Libya around the turn of the 20th century. I argue that the survivors of the civil war became the movers of Ottoman mass politics at a time of widening public space after the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. They took the lead in an empire-wide grassroots action. This was composed of public rallies and boycotts of Greece. The popular mobilization in this story is distinguished from earlier examples in protest-rich Ottoman history in three fundamental ways. First, longevity. We have a continuous occurrence of mass rallies from late 1908 until 1911. So take any Ottoman newspaper from October 1908. Chances are that every day you're going to see something about Crete, most of the time on the front page. It could be an article about Crete. It could be a news piece about a protest about Crete. So this is a continuous event for 3 years across the Ottoman Empire. And this is important to emphasize because before the Young Turk Revolution, there was strict censorship. No newspaper was allowed to write or say anything about Crete. Crete was one of the forbidden words under the regime of Abdülhamit II. And I can talk about that, why it was a forbidden word for about 12 years until the revolution in 1908. Second characteristic of these Crete protests is scope. These rallies covered the broad sweep of the Ottoman Empire. So this is a map that I prepared by just looking at petitions, protest petitions sent from different parts of the Ottoman Empire between January 1910 and June 1910. So it's a period of 6 months. And so these are the places where a protest rally happened. You don't have to count the dots. I counted them for you before. There are 282. Some of them are like overlapping. And especially in this area, you see, I mean, this is the area where most of the Cretan refugees also were resettled, Western Asia Minor, and also Macedonia. The third characteristic feature of these protests is novelty. These gatherings came in the wake of a 3-decade rule of Sultan Abdülhamid II. Under his rule, as I said earlier, strict censorship prevented any discussion about Crete in the press. The ban on political assembly prevented the gathering of masses in the streets and squares of the empire. So I'm talking about a novel phenomenon in Ottoman history. This novelty also relates to the very practice and aesthetics of protest. Flags and banners at the protest rallies, speeches and slogans, petitions sent to the government after protest rallies, and newspaper coverage of these rallies. All these marked the birth of modern popular protest in the empire. And Crete and the people from Crete were at the center of this phenomenon. So this is a photograph from Izmir. As you can see, people gathered with their flags in hand, with a banner. It says, in English, it would be, we would shed our blood, but won't give Crete away. Another one, again, in Izmir, you can see a larger crowd, part of the crowd. And this photograph is in black and white, obviously, but if you imagine this in color, it will be full of red with the flags and with the banners. So red was the characteristic color of these protest rallies. And what about the characteristic sound of these protest rallies? The slogan, Crete or death, ya Girit, ya ölüm. So this was the core slogan of these protest rallies across the Ottoman Empire. This is one example of a protest petition sent from Adana. And you have the signatures, organizing committee of the rally, and also what happened at the protest. So there are hundreds of protest petitions like this in the Ottoman archives. Okay. Last century of the Ottoman Empire is characterized by the displacement of millions of people from the Balkans and the Caucasus. So the displacement of Cretan Turks or Muslims is not a unique phenomenon. This was a century of displacement anyway. Historians have usually studied war and displacement as a connected phenomenon. Although this makes sense because war generates refugees. This approach results in the treatment of refugees as people in need, first of all, a mass victimized by catastrophic upheavals. Obviously, it would be unethical to overlook the humanitarian catastrophe caused by these wars. But emphasis on loss and victimhood obscures examples of refugee activism. In my book, I take displacement as a condition that generates not only victimhood, but also impetus for collective action. Accordingly, Cretan refugees are featured not as the manifestation of imperial collapse only, but rather as leading actors in the remaking and reshaping of an empire. It is, however, essential to break down the often undifferentiated category of refugees into its different class components. So I look at Cretan refugee activism in terms of activities of islanders from two distinct but mutually reinforcing classes: a middle class literati based in Istanbul and popular classes in several provincial urban centers. For the sake of time in this talk, I will focus on the lower classes who took part in the late Ottoman popular politics, not through their articles or conferences. This is what the middle class Cretans did in Istanbul. They wrote articles in newspapers, they gave conferences, but through their street action. As Crete rallies proliferated throughout the Ottoman provinces, an article appeared in Siperi Sayikaye Hürriyet, a newspaper published in Istanbul under the direction of Ahmet Cevat, who himself was from Crete, from Rethymno. The article predicted that Crete would remain part of the Ottoman Empire thanks to the effort of all Ottomans, I quote, united together, raising the cry of Crete or death, end quote. Perhaps this was wishful thinking, but the article nevertheless captured the core sound of popular mobilization throughout the empire with its emphasis on the slogan, Crete or death. In its coverage of the new street politics in the empire, Ahenk, a Turkish language newspaper from Smyrna, observed that every time people heard the word Crete, they uttered, I quote, the patriotic and gallant sound of Crete or death. I think 2 examples are enough. There are like hundreds of other examples like that, but I don't want to be repetitive with the same thing, just to emphasize that this was a thing that was very much emphasized by newspapers, but not only by newspapers, but also what people heard in Ottoman streets, in Ottoman towns and cities. Ahenk featured this oft-repeated slogan, Crete or death, in oversized fonts, as if to communicate the sound and the noise in the streets into the pages of its issue. So here you can see the article, it's this one, and here in large fonts, as you might know, Ottoman Turkish did not have capital letters. So it says, ya Girit, ya ölüm, Crete or death. So this was, in a way, I mean, we don't have sound recordings of these rallies. I wish we had. But in a way, the way newspaper, a written source, talked about these rallies conveys some kind of sound by writing the slogan in bold. And there are other examples like that. So maybe a way to read sound, hear sound, when it is not available. Amalfia, a Greek Ottoman daily from the same city, Smyrna, reported a rally organized by the city's Cretan community. The newspaper underscored the placards in the hands of protesters, which read, Crete or blood. Amalfia printed the phrase both in Turkish with Greek letters and also in Greek translation. Ya Girit, this is in Turkish, ya Girit, ya kan. Crete or blood. So hearing me talk about all these examples, perhaps you are thinking that this is just discourse, you know, newspapers writing about this, people talking about this at the rallies, bunch of people coming together, taking to the streets and shouting the slogan. It is important because this marks the birth of modern protest in the Ottoman Empire and imbues masses with an opportunity to practice politically active subjecthood. But what about more concrete stuff? It is definitely possible to talk about material impact of popular mobilization in the Ottoman Empire. In June 1910, for instance, Greek steamers were nowhere to be seen in the port of Salonika. In good old times, every week around 10 of them would visit Salonika. But now these were extraordinary times and there were no Greek steamers calling port in Salonika. In the empire's leading port city, Smyrna, prior to the protest movement, the Greek ships were the most prominent. Their numbers certainly diminished with the boycott. So this is from 1908. As you can see, there were 854 Greek steamers visiting port of Smyrna, more than Ottoman steamers. So these numbers would change with the boycott of Greece in 1909 and 1910. In August 1909, the French consul in Smyrna observed how the anti-Greece boycott disrupted the city's economic life. He picked out the lower class Cretans as the leading force in the boycott movement. According to the French consul, Cretans would burst into stores and demand the owners to fire Hellenic nationals on their payroll. The bands of Cretans from around the city would head to the harbor to prevent ships hoisting the Greek flag from unloading their cargo. The coverage of the boycott by Amalfia provides some weight to the French consul's claims. The newspaper reported that a band of Turkish Cretans had paid a morning visit to the Café Hermes on the seafront promenade. They gave the cafe's Hellenic proprietor 24 hours to take down the portraits of the King of Greece. Another Turkish Cretan group proceeded to the Hellenic-owned Café Labros to demand the removal of all the Hellenic insignia from the premises. They even asked that the color of the store's canopy be changed from Hellenic blue to Turkish red. So there are similar reports by Italian, Austro-Hungarian, and British consuls on similar acts by Cretans in Smyrna. And Cretan Turks in Smyrna composed about 10% of the city's population at this time, about 15,000, 20,000 people. Turkish Cretans mobilized Ottoman society not only through their loud street action, but also through their silent, lifeless bodies. At this point, recall the passage that I read at the beginning of the talk, the first paragraph in my book, in which Muslims who wanted to parade two dead bodies in Irakli in 1896 were prevented by the Ottoman governor. I mentioned that incident as an example of collective action triggered by death. In late 1909, two postcards were mailed to the Minister of Interior, Talat Bey. Talat Bey is the famous Talat Pasha later on the right. In the back, so this is the back of the postcard. In the back, there was a note wishing him success on the occasion of the parliament's convocation. Images on the front side of the postcards stood in stark contrast to the festive message of congratulations. One of them showed a dead man, Hüseyin Subasakis, in baggy trousers worn by Cretan peasants, naked above the waist, and with a deep scar in his head. His headband tinged with blood. The French caption noted that he was murdered. The Turkish caption that was later penciled in replaced murdered with martyred. This was presented as a hate crime in this postcard. The other image showed the dead body of Osman Korasakis. In this postcard too, murdered was changed to martyred in the Turkish translation. So it gives a sense about different audiences and how to write a caption. 6 months later, the periodical Resimli Kitap featured these two images in its June 1910 issue. For Ottoman readers, this was an eerily unusual sight in the pages of a popular magazine. Their publication demonstrates how the targeted audiences of images of death expanded from political figures to a larger public. With the title, Cretan Tragedies, the Turkish caption provided graphic details of the death of Hüseyin Subasakis. The opposite page displays the photograph of Osman Korasakis, and the resentful caption read, I quote, "From Crete, a tragic souvenir to the mercy and humanity of the entire civilized world," end quote. In such framing, the murder of Muslims in Crete rendered Western ideals of civilization and humanism a travesty in the eyes of some Ottomans. So I am about to finish, but I will say a little bit more about this issue. So while these images appeared in print, anti-Greece boycott in Salonika was intensifying. Greek steamers were being prevented from loading their third-party cargo, despite the recent decision of the Istanbul Boycott Committee that permitted those vessels to deliver third-party merchandise. Boatmen of Salonika refused to do anything with the Greek steamers, some of which carried Austrian timber and some Russian petroleum. Kerim Ağa, the head of boatmen in Salonika, bypassed the resolution of the Istanbul Boycott Committee because of the news that a Muslim man had been murdered in Crete. Obviously, I'm not talking about a displaced person here. The person who was murdered in Crete was not a displaced person. But in the dominant narrative about Crete in Ottoman newspapers of this time period, and also in Ottoman protest rallies, the island's Muslims, about 35,000 of them, lived precariously in constant danger of displacement, as befell their more than 70,000 co-islanders at the end of the 19th century. So the late Ottoman Empire offers a context to understand and to think about how the dead Muslim body was being politicized. And we can talk about this if you want in the Q&A, but this is an unprecedented phenomenon because you would have pictures of dead people in Ottoman newspapers, but this would always be like criminals, okay? Like criminals being hanged and as sending some kind of a message to the populace. So this is the first time that you have images of Muslim who were presented as martyrs. And think about that in general, in Islam, at that time and today, the displacement of Muslim bodies is not something that is very much approved of. So this is something to think about regarding the politicization of that body in the late Ottoman Empire in the context of Crete protests. When the European observers negatively portrayed Turkish Cretans' street action in Smyrna and other cities, they settled on a convenient explanation for their aggressiveness. Why are these people always, bothering and kind of harassing Greek shop owners? Why is it always Cretan Turks doing this? So their explanation was almost all the time Islamic fanaticism. These are the examples of Muslim fanaticism, and these are displayed by Cretan Muslims and Cretan Turks right now. So this very much fit into this trope of Oriental and Islamic fanaticism that was very much a dominant narrative in the 19th century in Europe. I mean, you can even argue even today. This explanation, I argue, takes Cretan refugees outside of history. It is oblivious to the history of their displacement, which severed them from their familiar native world and made them strangers in a strange land. Remember the snail example. Remember speaking Greek, not speaking a word of Turkish for most of these people. So these people, in the eyes of the established Muslim communities, were a lot of times seen as pseudo-Muslims. There are examples, like written examples, there are also more examples from oral history. So in my book, I explained the aggressiveness and the assertiveness of Cretan Turks in the protest movement against Greece as the result and even continuation of the civil war that shattered their lives a decade earlier. So this is a civil war with no closure. And I think this point is a suitable moment for me to conclude this talk by going back to the beginning and leaving you with this image on the left, which then became the cover of the book, and what I think is the remnants of this wall between these beautiful apartment blocks in center of Iraklio today. Thank you.
So thank you so very much, and look forward to reading the book from start to end. And Uğur has kindly brought a copy for the Institute's library, and we're very thankful about it. So the floor is open for questions. Is there anyone who would like to start? Just because maybe people.
Okay, thank you for the talk. I do agree with the use of civil war to describe the history of Crete in the 19th century. Maybe is more proper in the beginning of 19th century than in the end of 19th century. But also I use it when I talk to my students very often. That is a civil war. But on the other side, I wonder, maybe not all, but many wars and the revolution in the 19th century, in the 20th century, maybe until today, are civil war, or can be described in some places like civil war. For example, all the wars in the Balkans, or the revolutions in the Balkans, and today, the war in Ukraine, maybe we can see it like a civil war. So I don't think that is an analytical notion that can help us, the civil war. Is a state of things. On the other side, I think that in your talk, was a notion absent, nationalism. All these things which happening across the Ottoman Empire, the demonstrations with the flags and the banners and this modern thing, this novelty, is the nationalism. It's not the continuation of the Cretan civil war, is the, I think.
I agree. Many people think, and that's why actually I wanted to tell a story which is not, again, a story about nationalism, because nationalism is there. I'm not denying that there was no nationalism. And civil war at some point acquires a nationalistic character. It doesn't have to start as a nationalistic struggle, but at some point it starts acquiring a nationalistic character, especially after it was over. When we think about and when we try to remember, when we write history of what happened in that decade, it very much becomes a story of nationalism. So I didn't want to tell another story of nationalism. I wanted to tell a story with nationalism in the background, but other motives that led people to drive their neighbors from their land, to cut down their olive trees, or to kill them. Other motives than nationalism I wanted to focus on. Your point about maybe all wars are civil wars. Yeah, there is an argument that all revolutions are civil wars, which I don't reject. But again, I think my struggle is more with what kind of stories we tell today. And if we say not a revolution, not a conflict of nationalism, but civil war, how does that, if that changes, how does that change our understanding of these people who shared an island? That's why the idea of intimacy is very important to me. Because when you talk about a conflict as a nationalistic conflict, intimacy is not going to be the first thing that you're going to be talking about. You're going to be talking about mostly enemies, enemies who might hate one another. So we have a lot of stories written in that regard. Like even some historians writing in recent years, I'm not going to give names, talking about Muslim Cretans after 1908 in Ottoman Empire. Why were they so violent and aggressive? Explanation is that because they hated Greeks. So hatred for me is not something that I can demonstrate as a historian. So instead of hatred, I settled on the concept of resentment and scars that were not healed. Losing your land, losing your house, losing your olive trees, and the impossibility of going back. So that is the motivation. But there are things that I definitely agree with you. Yeah, and thank you for that.
If I may ask, when you say Greeks and that they denounced Greeks or they asked, Greeks to change the colors of their cafes, etc., does Greek include also Cretans, or do they separate between?
It's ambiguous. Officially, the boycott was against Yunan. Greeks of Greece, like Greek subjects, those who had Greek citizenship. That was the official boycott. The Union and Progress Party, which led the boycott movement, they made a strong effort to separate between subjects of Greece, like citizens of Greece, and Ottoman Greeks, like Rum. But in reality, these communities were very much intertwined. So in practice, you cannot really separate very easily. So the boycott started as a movement against strictly Yunan, Hellenes, right? Greeks from Greece. But quickly, it turned into a much broader and inclusive, so to speak, movement that a lot of times harmed the interests of Greeks who were native to Asia Minor or to the Black Sea region, not Greeks who came from Greek islands or from mainland Greece. And you can make the argument that this was a purposeful blurring, because then comes the question of why was the Union of Progress, Committee of Union and Progress Party interested in a boycott? This is the birth of milli iktisat, national economy in the Ottoman Empire, to replace especially Greeks in Ottoman businesses with Muslims, right? So the boycott against Greeks, Yunan or Rum, went hand in hand with the promotion of this policy of nationalizing or Turkifying or Muslimifying the Ottoman economy.
But sorry about it, but like to continue on this line. So would you say that Cretan Muslims in the Ottoman Empire became Turkish nationalists in the 1910s? Can one say that?
Many of them, yes. And also I think this goes back to my earlier opening of the talk when I talked about Cretan characteristics, how they were different from the Muslims who came from the Balkans, for instance. They did not have to be called Turks by Turkish nationalists later on. Even while they were in Crete, they were called Turks by their Greek neighbors. They themselves, most of the time, called themselves Turks, right? Turcos. They were infrequently in the late 19th century called Musulmanos. They were mostly in the 1890s called Turcos. So they were, in a way, in the eyes of their neighbors or strangers, their perception was Turkish. So they did not they did not have to be Turkified, right? Later on. So that maybe is another factor that made it easier for not all, but many of Turkish Cretans more amenable to accept and promote Turkish nationalism in the late Ottoman Empire. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation. I read the thesis version, so I think it's not. You probably changed it to make the book. So I have two questions. First, it is how you situate yourself in a kind of conflict between a top-down perception of the boycotts that you have, for instance, in Fuad Dündar's writings, where the Unions and Progress Committee is the main organizer, and a different approach, such as Doğan Çetinkaya''s from below, where you have popular actors that are very important. That's my first question. I mean, where do you find the committee, and where are the other actors? My second one is concerns this. It joins a little bit what our colleague Paraskevas Matalas said. It is you speak of the Cretan Turks or the Cretan Muslims. I agree that they were called Turkey, so that helped to be identified as Turks as a whole. So I think that there were different categories among them. For instance, we know that the Club of Union and Progress of Chania were one of the most important clubs among in the whole. So you have literate people, ideologists, you have peasants. They're all acting in the same way. That's my two questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for these questions. So where is the CUP in this, like, or where do I stand between like popular explanation of this protest and also like CUP-led movement? In the talk, I didn't talk about this, but there are two sections of visible Cretan Muslims or Cretan Turks in the Ottoman Empire until 1908 in the protest movement, I talked a little bit about the popular classes, people on the streets whose names we don't know. But we see things about them in European consular reports and also Ottoman newspapers. The group that I didn't talk about are the intellectuals, journalists, politicians based in Istanbul. So in late 1908, actually, they took the lead in making Crete a meaningful topic to mobilize larger Ottoman society, to write about Crete. What did Crete mean for the Ottomans? What is this island? Because not everyone knew about Crete. So how did the Ottomans take this island? So there is so much emphasis in these writings by these Cretan intellectuals, journalists, and also speeches by these politicians. 25-year-long siege of Iraklion, and taking Iraklion and completing the conquest of Ireland in the mid-17th century, the latest Ottoman conquest. This is how Crete was presented to the public. Thousands of people became martyred when the Ottomans tried to conquer Crete. So there's so much blood shed for this island. So this was the core of this discourse that was propagated by these intellectuals, journalists, and politicians of Cretan background. These people and the CUP, there is an overlap, almost a complete overlap. They were all members of the CUP. If they were not members of the CUP, they were sympathizers with the CUP. So I think that answers partly, at least, your first question. And in terms of there are groups within this Cretan Muslim community, you're right, absolutely. One challenge here is that it is not, if you are looking for documents, and this is what historians do, right? You have to find documents. It is not always possible to find documents that capture the entire complexity and diversity of the Cretans. I, for instance, in a very small article, in a Greek Ottoman newspaper article, I read something about boycott in Antalya, and the article mentioned a small detail, just one sentence, but it gives you a good insight into the diversity of Cretans in the Ottoman Empire. Not all of them were anti-Greek or anti-Yunan, anti-Hellen, right? So one of the coffee owners from Crete, Muslim, one of the coffee owners, Cretan Muslim in Antalya, didn't care about the boycott, and he started serving his Greek customers coffee, and then some other Cretan Turks living in the same city, they beat him up. So this is just one example I found, but if there is one example, I think you can easily argue that there are more examples, because in history, there is not really such a thing as the unique example, one and only. But there is a challenge to find similar voices. And such opposing voices you would see only in sources that were at odds with the CUP. CUP newspapers wouldn't talk about a Cretan Muslim not caring about the boycott. Right?
Thank you. This was very exciting. I really enjoyed it. I think that, of course, one should think of parameters such as displacement and how it impacted the psyche of these people, and how they it would eventually lead to such tensions, and that we have to think of these perspectives. I however, also believe that there is a certain prehistory of this phenomenon that needs to be examined, because I think that it bears a lot of, how shall I call them, pre-modern elements that are not existent in this narrative. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, there's a culture of violence in Crete, which goes back, a culture of violence, I said. vendetta and so on, blood feuds and so on.
Mhm.
Okay, so this is one issue that one has to seriously take into account if one has to understand popular protest in Crete, or for that matter, outside of it by Cretans, because what I see many times, even before these events, is the transfer of a kind of a customary law that exists in Crete, wherever Cretans are.
Mhm.
So let me give you a couple of examples. Like in Izmir, Cretans have been established at least since the early 18th century, but since the 1760s, we know that they had a very robust community, all right? They were mainly trading with Alexandria and Istanbul, Crete, of course, and Chios. So they were covering these distances as captains and so on. They were mostly janissaries, using their janissary privileges in order to, to leverage their position there as merchants. After the Chesme naval battle in 1770, they were the ones that started the massacres against Christians, the Cretans there. Then in 1797, they were also the ones that started the infamous rebellion of Izmir, which resulted in the deaths of thousands, janissaries, again, Cretans. And in 1821, basically they instigated tens of rebellions, Cretans again, around Anatolia, with, of course, Izmir, Ayvalık, and so on being at the epicenter. The result was that in 1822, the Ottoman administration had to kick out of Izmir around 500 of them and bring them back to the island so that they can fight against the Greeks instead of, like massacring them there. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a certain, prehistory, and that this is based on more than modern protesting. It's a more complicated phenomenon that also has to do with cultural elements that should be in this analysis.
Mhm.
And of course, it has to do with networks, because Cretans might, of course, might have left en masse for Izmir, during the 19th century, but they were there for many, many decades before that. So one should consider these elements as well. I want to thank you. This was a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. But do you have something to comment on these facts?
Thank you. This is a really important, and I think for me, thought-provoking question, and maybe reason for another work in the future where I go back further in time. But what you talk about, is something that is emphasized a lot of times. I mean, for the sake of simplicity, let's divide it into two. I will be a little bit simplistic here, like pro-Greece, pro-Enosis Cretans versus anti-Greece, anti-Enosis Cretans. Pro-Greece Cretans versus pro-Ottoman Cretans. Okay? For pro-Greece Cretans in the late 19th, early 20th century, all these, not the events that you talk about, but some earlier events like various uprisings in medieval times against the Venetians, like countless of them. They were narrated as events that proved something about the Cretan character. So this is about culture, right? But that Cretan character for this camp, like pro-Greece camp, was not something violent or like savage, but something freedom-loving, right? Thirst for liberty. I mean, even Kazantzakis himself, I think, is close to this kind of thinking about Cretan character. They cannot be subjugated. They would violently go against subjugation. And proof is in history, many times against Venetians, many times against Ottomans. Now go to the Ottoman side, pro-Ottoman Cretans or pro-Ottoman non-Cretan Turks, talking about all these uprisings. For them, this proves something dark about the Cretan character, that they were savage and they were unruly. And going back to medieval times, they were very violent. Even in the Bible, Cretans are talked about as a tribe as a mendacious tribe, as an untrustworthy tribe, going back to the Bible. So this proves that they need to be tamed. And the latest incident of their unruliness in the 1890s, in the eyes of the Ottomans, is basically the continuation of this age-old, immemorial almost story. So it is very important because on the one hand, you should not, you should not deny certain cultural traits that manifested themselves over and over again in history, in Crete or outside of Crete with Cretans. But on the other hand, I will try to strike a balance which will not drag me into a very culturalist territory in which I talk about, supremacy of culture. So I need to find a way to talk about some national ethnic characteristics that were there and presented themselves, but also find a way to contextualize in history and try to understand why such characteristics burst out in certain times, but not always. What are the historical factors that set in motion, so to speak, this traits that many contemporary observers commented on? And the question of vendetta. One of the Ottoman governors, Alexandros Pasha, Alexandros Karatheodoris, he was a very actually distinguished figure and he served in Crete a couple of times. He wrote about, he didn't say civil war, but he suggested civil war. He said, this violence in Crete happens all the time. It's a vendetta. Sometimes it is sleeping. Most of the time it is sleeping, but there are times it comes onto the surface and turns into large-scale massacre, mutual killings. So there is in his explanation this sleeping case of vendetta. Again, I need to find a balance between these two explanations and ways of looking at history. Thank you. Very important.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We learned a lot of things we didn't know. You said somewhere that Cretan Muslims in Crete were regarded as Turks by their Greek neighbors. Mm-hmm. Did I get it right?
You're right.
Okay.
You're right.
There are quite a number of texts of this period, Greek texts, that refer to them as an in-between group. That is, they're not authentic Turks and they're not authentic Christians. They call themselves Turks, but they really have Christian characteristics and they participate in Christian rituals. Mm-hmm. And most of all, they don't even speak real Turkish, the real Turkish language. They know, they scarcely know a few Turkish words. And I don't know if you've ever encountered this kind of texts in your research. They were called, in these texts, the term they use to describe them is a term, well, my Turkish is really almost inexistent, is a term Burma.
Burma. Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly what it means. It should be a Turkish word, shouldn't it? I don't know. A Turkish word. Okay. So they were not considered as Turks, really. Mm-hmm. They were sort of despised because they thought they were Turks, but they weren't. And they had an in-between identity, mm-hmm. Therefore a non-identity, mm-hmm. an inexistent identity. And also it was an effort, if we can say, an effort to integrate them into the Christian community, mm-hmm. that they should be integrated mm-hmm. into the Christian community, mm-hmm. but they don't get integrated because they call themselves Turks and they mm-hmm. think themselves mm-hmm. to be Muslim. Mm-hmm. So this is an interesting point, which
Yes, it is very interesting, and I
I
will
would
look
like you to comment on this.
Yeah, thank you so much. I will look into that. But personally, in the 1890s or early 1900s, I did not come across this specific term. But I can tell you one thing, which is in my documents, like Greek documents, like Cretan Greek documents, most of the time, Cretan Muslims or Cretan Turks were seen, I mean, of course, again, going back to the earlier question, like differences within the community. It's not like a monolithic community, right? I mean, rural community versus city community. And also Crete is such a big island, right? Muslims in Kissamos, Muslims in Stia, Yara Petra. But in the general sense, in the Greek sources, Muslim or Turkish Cretans were mostly seen as converts into Islam after the Ottoman conquest, right? So in a way, kind of betrayed their true identity, but they kept their language. But if you look at the Turkish sources, some sources written by Turkish Cretans themselves, they were actually Turks, most of them, who went to Crete with the Ottoman armies because the conquest took so long, like almost 30 years. They settled down there, but then eventually they were assimilated into the dominant culture, which was Greek. But ethnically speaking, I mean, there is this effort after 1908 to establish some kind of Anatolian Turkish origin to these Turks or Muslims living in Crete, who eventually lost their Turkish language and also some other characteristics that were common to their 17th century ancestors. Yeah. But Burma, I have not come across this, but I will be careful about this. Thank you.
I would like to thank you also for your presentation, and I would like to ask a question regarding one of the basic notions of yours, this of civil war. I would like to ask the following. In order to speak of a civil war, it would be necessary to have probably a notion of a unified community, not dominantly, but you know, reality is complex most of the times. For instance, if we go back, as Paraskevas Matala suggested, in 1821, in the rebellion in Crete, there we have ambiguous identities, and we have some voices saying that we are all Cretans and let's revolt all together against the Ottoman rule now in the circumstances of the general uprising against the Ottoman rule. Of course, as we know, this didn't happen, and the 1821 rebellion, it is a civil war because violence just after that was mainly orientated against the Muslims of Crete and not so much against the representatives of the Sublime Porte. But we had these voices speaking of a unified, imaginarily, Cretan community. Do we have these voices in 1896?
We have these voices in 1896, and those who had an issue with the Ottoman administration, these voices expressed themselves as a demand to go back to status quo ante, to Halepa Pact, 1878. Because 1878, after another turmoil on the island, Halepa Convention was signed, which granted extensive autonomy to the island. And it led to a 10-year period of peace, right? There was no uprising. And Muslims and Christians in politics, there were times that they worked together in party politics. But in 1889, these privileges were abrogated by the central state, by the Sultan. And actually, even though I start the book in 1895, if I had space, I should have started in 1889. because what happens in 1889 finds its opportune moment, so to speak, to turn this discontent into a large-scale armed struggle in 1895. So in order to answer your question positively, and my answer is yes, there are voices like that, and those voices had to be traced, especially after 1878 in the 1880s, regardless of their religion. But then you might ask, if there was discontent in 1889, why wasn't there big, let's say, conflict on the island? Why did we have to wait until 1895? And that goes to your question, earlier question about nationalism. There is a group which I didn't even talk about in the talk, but I talk about it in the book, Epitropy, right? That was an armed group that was definitely nationalistic. Their aim was to unite Crete with Greece. Most of these members of this group were educated in Greece. Most of them were Cretan, but they came from Greek education, right? And if you look at their secret correspondence, which I saw in Hania, in the archives in Hania, you see something repeating itself a couple of times, several times, which is today, this is late 1895. Right now, it is really the good moment, the best moment to organize something, because the Ottoman Empire is in trouble with the Armenians. There are Armenian massacres in Anatolia, and European public is very much against the Ottoman state right now. So if we start an organized movement right now, it will be different from organized movements in the earlier times when Europe was not very sympathetic towards us. Right now, Europe is very much anti-Ottoman because of the Armenian massacre. So now is the time. So that's why 1895 is the time to start for Epitropy, this organized movement of opposition to the Ottoman state, which starts with, I mean, when Epitropy is in arms, there are in Western countryside, like around Stelinos, around Sfakia, some killings, but isolated killings. You know, some Muslims are killed, some Christians are killed, but there is no massacres. There is no like large-scale violence. But quickly after 1896, early 1896, these isolated incidents of violence expand to other parts of the island. And that's where I find the explanation of civil war meaningful. It basically gets out of hand, and people, I mean, villagers who had most of them had no Epitropy or Ottoman ideology, they either flee for their lives because they know that if they don't, they will be killed. And sometimes there are also instances they kill because they don't want to be killed. So this is basically this spiral of civil war, neighbors killing one another, people who speak the same language, who have similar traditions, killing each other. Why didn't they kill each other earlier times? So this is the question to answer. And then I think 1895, the abrogation of the privileges given to Crete in 1870, in 1889, and then what happens in the larger Ottoman Empire with the Armenian massacres and how these massacres impact this island society and the action of this small group of people called Epitropy. I think these are all the factors that I try to take into account in explaining a very complex phenomenon.
Yeah, I wanted just to join you with this argument. I think that at this specific period, after Halepa and the Kritiki Politia, we can speak of the formation of something as a Cretan ethnicity in Bathian term. I mean, a common belonging. It is at last the argument that we set aside in an article that we wrote in Turkish with a colleague of mine, Athanasis Koulariki. It's published in the volume in Turkish and about the exchange of population that is published now. And I think that there is, to answer to Nikos's question, that the political situation allows for the formation of something that lasts even after 23, something that we can call a Cretan ethnicity that is there. And there is a dialectical relation between nationalisms and this ethnicity that is formed at the same time, in contradiction and dialogating with this ethnicity. I don't know what.
I think it is still, I mean, even today, I think that's present, right? I mean, ethnicity, maybe it has ethnic understanding. I mean, when I said today, in my understanding, it's first, there is a history to that, right? I mean, there was some kind of an island identity. It's impossible to deny that. It became institutional. It became institutionalized with the establishment of a state, 1898, with a flag, with a constitution, right? It was separate from Greece. It was separate from the Ottoman Empire. So there was this institutional background as well, in addition to the cultural background. And I would say, not always, but when it manifests itself today as a separate identity, it's a lot of times is a product of resentment, you know, like outsiders. When I mean outsiders, people who are not from this island, controlling how this island is run, right? When I was in, like years ago, when I was in the archives in Hanya, someone came to the reading room. He was not a researcher. He was there to fix something. Then he started talking with me. You know, he found out that I was from Turkey. You know, he was a little bit nationalistic, I guess. So we didn't get into an argument, but, you know, he said, you know, one day Hagia Sophia would be taken again, this kind of thing. Then he left, and then the Konstantinos Kostas, who was the archivist, he said, Xenos. And I thought, like, not Greek, you know, but he meant he's not from Crete, you know. So, I mean, that thing for me was very interesting because, I mean, it's not just one example. I'm sure you know more examples, but this idea of like foreignness, even though that guy was Greek but not Cretan, it says something about this special identity or ethnicity. Sorry?
Where is your level?
Yeah. In the US at this time, people would be sleeping, you know. I mean, this is the first time that I'm like getting questions like, is it like 10 p.m. or something? I'm not complaining, but it's very interesting.
You mentioned earlier isolated killings in rural areas. So was that more to do with personal issues or with a nationalistic concept within the rebellion? And how were those presented in the press at the time?
Most of the time, this isolated like murders, like in the summer of 1895 and the fall of 1895, mostly in the countryside, they were presented mostly as racialized killings, you know, I mean, politically motivated murders. And a lot of times, for instance, someone in a village in the region of Stelinos would be killed, and then the explanation would be the person who was killed, actually his relative killed a Christian in Hanya. So it was like a revenge killing. Not all killings were like that, but many times motive was presented as either racialized or religious killing or revenge killing, some kind of a mini vendetta, maybe. But then this increases in numbers and then basically gets out of control, out of hand.
I also have a question because, you know, like you said that I know that you try to avoid it because of most probably because of time, restrictions of time. But I wanted to ask why Abdul Hamid considered Crete to be a forbidden word, and I was wondering if this has to do with the fact that in 1889, you have basically the abrogation of a pretty much constitutional polity on Crete. So this is intriguing. I wanted to hear if this is the reason why.
I think that's a great question. Crete has a lot of, I try not to use the word unique a lot of times because, what is unique? But there are some unique things maybe about Crete, as from the Ottoman perspective. It was the last major conquest that took a lot of time to conquer this island. So it became a very important feature after 1908, right? 30 years of siege. Another interesting thing about Crete, which you cannot find in other areas of the empire, is that in the 19th century, the Ottomans lost a lot of wars in Europe, right? Especially against Russia. You wouldn't be surprised when Ottomans, lost a war because, that was what was happening. They were losing territory all the time. But there is a war that the Ottomans won in 1897 against Greece. And that war was mostly motivated by what was happening in Crete. It was not fought in Crete. It was fought in Thessaly. But Crete was the main reason. Ottomans won the war, but they lost Crete. So, military success, diplomatic failure. And who is the Sultan? Hamid is the Sultan. So, if you talk about Crete, then you have to talk about what's happening in Crete. Who is ruling Crete right now? It's not an Ottoman governor ruling Crete. It's the son of Greek king who came to Crete on a torpedo boat during the war with the Ottoman Empire in 1897. So these were very uncomfortable truths that the Sultan did his best to hide from the public. But the newspapers published by Young Turks in Cairo, in Paris, in Geneva, because there was no censorship there, the Sultan's hand did not reach. They were constantly, in 1896, 1897, talking about Crete. They were constantly blaming the Sultan. You fought for this island, but you gave this island away. So you are basically a traitor. That was the main reason why Crete was a forbidden topic. There were some other forbidden words, but for me, the interesting thing is that Crete was one of them.
Let's take one last question also. Just a minute. Two last questions then. We also keep Eleni, our IT officer, who's not visible in the room, but she's here waiting for us. So.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question regarding, you mentioned that many of these Muslim Cretans were resettled. You mentioned some of the places, but in your presentation, you didn't discuss Libya at all. And I was wondering if you had anything to say about the Cretans that were sent over there. I guess so.
Yeah, that's another important region. I mean, there were also several protests in Benghazi and Tripoli. I didn't mention them. There were more than 10,000 Cretan Muslims actually settled in Libya, mostly in the eastern part, near the Benghazi region and also the hinterland of Benghazi. That was an agricultural region, and the main reason why the Ottoman state wanted these Cretan Muslims to be resettled there was they wanted to use them as some kind of a bulwark, some kind of a defense against the Bedouins and also the Sunusi tribe. So Libya was one of the regions where the Ottoman state was trying to consolidate its authority in the late 19th century. And for the state administrators, Muslims from Crete who had some kind of a battle experience, right? Because, I mean, not only in the 1890s, but in previous conflicts, some of them fought. Some of them were başıbozuk, right, irregulars. So their fighting experience and maybe their cultural characteristics of being very, virile and kind of aggressive and assertive was very useful for the state trying to consolidate its authority against these tribal and semi-tribal groups in eastern Libya. So that was the main motivation. And also Libya is very close, right? A lot of times, I mean, I didn't think much about this, the proximity of Libya to Crete. But really, I mean, Crete and Libya, one can argue, is the part of the same small world, so to speak.
Congratulations for the book.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you, you showed before some pictures with some bodies. Can you give us the source and if it's possible, the place where the bodies were, the village that is?
Which pictures?
Which villages, the bodies that you showed before? Thank you.
They were not from the village, actually. I believe my memory might be tricking me, but I believe Rethymno, but there is another one. That I would like to end with. So this is a newspaper, Ottoman newspaper called Süngü. Süngü means bayonet. It was published in Monastir, Macedonia, in 1911. So interestingly, I found this, as you can see, the stamp. I found this in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs archive in Athens. It was inside the Greek consuls from Monastir, his files, the entire newspaper. This is the front page of the newspaper. And to my knowledge, this is the first time that a Muslim Turkish newspaper published a murdered person, a dead Muslim. Again, I showed you a couple of images. Same thing here, similar thing, like he was martyred. And he was a cobbler in Hania. So he had a store there. And people you see here, his identity is unknown to me. The newspaper doesn't talk about him, but these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kids, his children, orphans. And there is a baby, and this guy's name was Musa Tsopanakis. I'm showing this photograph because it's a little bit, even eerie. At some point, like some months ago, someone got in touch with me saying that they read my dissertation, my book wasn't out. It was last year. And they saw this photograph and they said, the baby here, Musa, baby's name also Musa, the great-grandfather. So what happened to this family? We don't see the wife of this person. They were taken by the Ottoman state in 1911 and resettled, taken to Istanbul. I mean, most Cretan families were resettled in small towns in the Aegean region or Libya, Syria. But with this family, there is some kind of exception because a murder took place. So they were taken to Istanbul. Kids were given to school, provided by the state. And the family that I learned from this person, family, of course, the wife and the kids, they spoke only Greek. They did not speak a single word of Turkish. So basically what happened is a period of assimilation and a life of challenges because of not being able to speak the language that most people in Istanbul, especially in the Muslim community, did. So this picture, I think, can be seen in relationship with the other photographs that I showed. Sometimes I have, uncertainty, should I use these photographs? Because it's a little bit of a sensitive thing, to show the photographs of people who were murdered. Not everyone wants to see the photograph of dead people. So that's another dilemma of a historian or maybe, I don't know, like anthropologists, what to do with the pictures of dead people. So I have my own way of.
There is no name of the
He's from Hanya. I need to look at the captions. The village is there, but it's blurry. I cannot read it. Can you write it now? Is it Simone? Samone? And this one, it's here, but I cannot really read it. Is it Koksare? Iowa City. Okay, yeah.
So thank you very much, Uğur, and thank you all for being here tonight. And
Thank you for everyone for being here.